I gave my little talk here a title of The End of Illusions. I really want to talk about the state of affairs that we've arrived at today and try to trace the path that we took to get to where we are today. Let me begin with a very short description of the current state of affairs, which I think we can label as the era of the end of illusions. Over the last 25 or 30 years, the economy has been transformed. Numerous books and articles refer to the jobless economy, the jobless future, in reference to the application of the computer and its potential, in theory at least, to eliminate human labor at the point of production. At the very least, the jobs of the Fordist era are more or less gone. The new economy holds little prospect for any stability of employment. The capitalist class has been transformed into a class of managers and brokers. They oversee vast pools of money capital, not productive capital, but socialized capital in the form of sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, hedge funds, its own. And these funds move in a global playing field, national markets being merely the little blocks in their sandbox. While capital defines its turf as global, the working class is defined by law and organization as national. They are hamstrung in their ability to challenge global capital. The possibilities for capital expansion, moreover, are in decline. Geographically, the world has been more or less subordinated to capital. The consumer market is more or less saturated with little else to commodify. The expansion, such as it is, of capital is in the realm of circulation. For the most part, they're concentrating value that's already produced rather than producing new value. With respect to the liberal democratic state, these powers have been usurped or precluded by a set of global agencies and organizations that are not democratic or certainly not accessible by the citizens of the world. There's a deep cynicism that's set in across the working classes of the world about the potential of liberal democracy. And that cynicism is revealed in the widespread apathy with respect to elections, and cynicism with respect to politicians and the political process. In the place of a belief in democracy and its legitimacy, we find the systematic growth of the surveillance or security state, that is the growth of police and surveillance technology, among many other means for social control. The ability of the state, the ability to use the state in elections to exact more reforms in the form of Keynesianism appears to be over. For now, it appears to be a losing struggle just to maintain what was won, in the face of deregulation and privatization. I think it's fair to say that we've come to a crossroads in the development of capitalism. Every era in its development has been different, of course, but now the place of the working class and political rule have changed. There's a qualitative different future in the offing. And this is what the Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Everything movement is telling us. It is as yet only an inchoate, symbolic statement of the end of an era. It has no program, it has no analysis. We are the 99% is not an analysis. There is no organization, there is no sense of the future, and there are no demands. But it is an awakening, however tentative and undeveloped. And in fact, its own naivete is telling us, as the 99%, just how unprepared we are to confront what is before us. Well, how did we get here? The current situation reveals to us the very dilemma in capitalism that until now has largely been obscured. And that dilemma is that capitalism produces a class that has no stake in the system. Well, what does this mean? Capitalism is a system in which production is for profit and not for human need. This is a goal that benefits a class that owns the means of production, but leaves the producers in a position that they have to demand and struggle for their share of the social product. The principle of the system is to create profit and accumulate capital, and it is structured for this purpose and to prevent the non-owners from overturning it. So there's a dilemma. That is, what to do about a majority that produces the wealth but has no stake or claim or interest in the system, and whose interests lie in another form of property. How do you control, contain, confuse, divide, and rule a class that has no interest in the success of the system? This dilemma was understood by capital at the outset of capitalism, already in the 19th century, when capitalism was coming into its own. And here I'm referring to the moment at which capital subordinates every aspect of social reproduction to itself. And this is also the period of the making of the working class, the modern working class. But already at that point, capital had understood that there was a class that was a threat to the very system that it produced the wealth for. It is demonstration enough that the working class has no stake in the system insofar as it has to fight for the right to vote. It had to gain an electoral vote through struggle. And secondly, that it had to fight for itself to gain sufficient compensation for its labor in order to reproduce itself. So this dilemma produces paradoxes. The ruling class cannot kill the geese that lay the golden eggs, so it must accommodate to a degree to maintain the system of accumulation. It must do what it can to prevent a class war that would stop accumulation and prevent reducing the working class to a mass of poverty and despair. How do you address this dilemma, and how was it addressed? Well, there are two main means that historically the powers that be have addressed this dilemma. The first one is in the actual structuring of liberal democratic constitutions. It's interesting, actually, when you look back at the formation and discussion of the American Constitution, you will see much of this very debate going on. How do we create a constitution that pretends to be democratic and yet prevents a class that does not have property from overturning the system? The structure of liberal democracy was designed to prevent the unthinkable, and that was that the propertyless, or those without a stake in the system, would gain executive power through the legislature via universal franchise. By the early 19th century, the demand for the universal right to vote was growing throughout the then industrializing world. The achievement of this right for the working class, a necessary concession, quickly led to the formation of political parties that represented their demands. Socialist and communist parties that grew up in the early to mid 19th century. This resulted in reform policies even amongst the mainstream parties, and soon resulted in social reforms like the ones in the late 19th century, particularly in Germany, Britain, France, and even in the United States and Canada, albeit very limited. These were reforms, after all. They were not fundamental changes to the system. And as reforms, they were anomalous. They were not contradictory to the principles of the system. They are forms of state rules and regulations and programs that ameliorate the worst effects of the system. But they are concessions that can be expanded or contracted or even eliminated in relation to the rate of accumulation or to the threat to the system presented by the condition and degree of consciousness of the working class. But liberal democracy, universal enfranchisement, and the possibility of reforms have all gone a very long way to obscuring for the working class the fact that it has no inherent stake in the system. The achievement of the right to vote, the right to be elected, brought the appearance of being part of the system, at least in the political domain. But the powers that be have rarely suffered from any similar illusion. Perhaps not a utopia, but in the political sphere, by the second half of the 19th century, the working class could feel that their votes counted in the same way as those of other classes. In the political domain, everyone appeared as equals. And this was and is a powerful veil over the actual position in the economy where workers are anything but equal. The second solution to the dilemma of a class that has no stake in the system and yet is essential to the system is the institutionalization of class struggle. And this, again, you see beginning in the late 19th century. As soon as capital had entirely subordinated social reproduction to itself, and the working class was in the making, class conflict at the point of production became an issue that often threatened the stability of the system itself. Strikes and other forms of work stoppages were antithetical to capital accumulation. And so the fight for the working class, for trade union representation, and for collective bargaining became something that had to be accommodated by the system, along with employment laws and conditions of work. All had to be brought under the control of the state so that the conflicts in the economic realm did not threaten the system. So the dilemma that capitalism produces a class that provides the golden eggs for the system, but at the same time a class that has no stake in that system, is resolved more or less through liberal democracy and industrial relations and laws that pacify and control the working class. But on the eve of achieving these victories for itself, the working class had to face the onset of the long depression in the late 19th century, from 1873 to 1896, where the misery was sometimes offset by the remaining rural links held by sections of the working class. Because economic recessions and depressions almost always expose the legitimacy of liberal democracy for what it is. Fortunately for capital, the end of the depression in the 1890s brought the growth of worldwide capital and the coming of Taylorism and mass production. This was the beginning of mass consumer goods and the rise of industrial unions, which in effect, this upturn in the business cycle, mass production, meant effectively that a better standard of living could be won and hoped for by the working class. It was the first time that a claim could be made that capitalism could not only give the working class a political voice, but would also allow for generalized aspirations of a higher standard of living within the system. The working class could begin to feel that there was a place for it in the system after all. And then comes World War I. In World War I, the working classes of Europe and North America were led to a slaughter, one of the greatest bloodlettings up to that time. And in a sense, the cat was out of the bag. The working class became conscious of its role in that conflict and conscious of the nature of that conflict. Out of World War I comes three major developments. One was the arrival of the USSR, the Soviet Union, which becomes, for the first time in history, the hoped-for alternative to capitalism for the working classes, a workers' state. But it really was, of course, was socialized capital that continued to exploit the workers, albeit in their own name. But the continuation of the labor-capital relation was there and evident for all to see. The working class never did rule themselves in the Soviet Union. The second result of World War I was the arrival of liberal democracy for Germany, in the form of the Weimar Republic, which in effect could not succeed in the post-war era because of war reparations demanded under the Treaty of Versailles, made economic recovery impossible for Germany. And so German liberal democracy is doomed even before it can establish itself. Big capital puts its money behind Hitler in order to forestall legislative victories for parties representing the interests of workers. The third major result of World War I is the new technology that comes out of the war. This is incipient Fordism in the form of Taylorism and the assembly line, allowing for another increase in the material standards of living of the working class of the capitalist world. In other words, capitalism could still expand and supply more material goods to the working class. It could offer hope in the form of material progress, albeit in a spiritless world. Well, the post-war era was very short-lived. The first half of the 1920s was, of course, Reconstruction and not very good conditions anywhere. The second half of the 1920s, things did change. But then, of course, arrives the Great Depression. German democracy could not survive the post-war economic disaster brought on by the Treaty of Versailles and then the 1930s depression. The legitimacy of the Weimar Republic could not be sustained without the economic stability of expanding capitalism. The USSR, which was developing through uncharted territory, falls under the dictatorship of Stalin by 1929 or 1930 and becomes, in effect, a police state. There is enormous economic development, but at enormous cost to the working class. They have no real political voice. By 1929, any hope for a future for the socialist experiment is really over. Economic development in the US, in the United States, and other capitalist economies crashes with the 1929 depression. And of course, that raises questions of the political legitimacy of the system. The system does not work. And at that point, there is a rise in the strength of communist and socialist parties throughout the industrial world. One of the problems, of course, is that those parties that begin to represent the working class are, through that period, largely under the sway of Stalinist communist parties, and so subordinate to the analysis and the mistakes of the Soviet Union. It is very difficult at this time to find an independent voice on the left. The choice was between Soviet Union or Moscow, social democratic or reformist parties, or authoritarian governments such as grew up early in Italy and then later in Germany. In other words, none of the options available for the working class could provide an independent and critical voice for the industrial working classes of the world. Well, what kind of solutions were offered during the Great Depression for the working class? There were three main possibilities that arise during the Great Depression. One is the continuation, consolidation of state capitalism in the Soviet Union. But here now, using capitalist management principles and capitalist incentives, forced labor for much of the economy, the worker state is patently finished in all but name. Fascism arises first in Italy and expands to Germany and Japan. And in fact, the failure of civilian markets were met with the militarization of the economy and dictatorial politics, all in order to save capitalism. Capital goes fascist, militarizes the economy, and politics become a police state in order to control the working class and prevent alternatives to capitalism. In the United States, however, and in other capitalist nations, there's another option that arrives, and that is the beginning of the possibility of the Keynesian welfare state. It takes the form in the United States of the New Deal. U.S. capital, of course, debates whether it should go fascist or Keynesian. It's very interesting to see that debate. But with room still to grow domestically, it obviously opts to go, not without difficulty, down the road of the welfare state and the New Deal. Unlike the USSR and Germany, Japan, and Italy, there was to be a continuation of liberal democracy in the US and in some Western European nations. There, the working class would retain its political liberty within certain circumscribed boundaries, and it lives to fight it out in the economic sphere with strict legal frameworks within industrial relations law. So all three solutions that arise in the 1930s retain the structures of power of capital over labor. In that sense, they're all the same. They were all attempts to provide solutions to a capitalist system that had failed its working classes. They all left capitalism in place, but they pacified their working classes in different ways, through police repression, mobilization for war, or with social reforms, or with a combination of the two. And they all did it with constitutions structured to prevent the working class from taking power. The Great Depression ends with World War II, which represents probably the greatest leap in technology up to that time. In the short 5 to 6 years of that war, there was the development of the basis of modern Fordism. Here we see the full development of Taylorism and the assembly line. We see this stimulus of the war effort is matched by post-war reconstruction. Capital now begins to expand across the entire world, especially with the decolonization. It turns its focus also to the consumer market and begins the process of commodifying virtually all the needs of the working classes. There is also a rise of military Keynesianism, that is the arrival of permanent military spending. Capital also begins at this point after World War II to go global, leaving labor as a national phenomenon. After World War II, it becomes part of American policy to advocate the Keynesian welfare state and liberal democracy for everyone. And this is done through, of course, the United Nations. So at home, within the industrial nation states, Keynesianism, which is the counterpart to Fordism, is developed. There's a high demand for labor, results in high wages. There's expanding capital, domestic and global expansion. There is the increase in the development, further development of socialism, which is a threat to capitalism. Of course, that all spells the need to provide the working classes with something much more than what the 1930s had brought. The Keynesian welfare state was the solution to all these problems in the industrial nations. So in effect, what it does is it provides a range of goods and services not available via the marketplace. Capitalism in this post-war era looks pretty good, with an increasing total social, a share of the total social product going to the working classes. In the United States, this was of course called the American dream, which really amounts to the completion of the commodification of life, a nirvana for the American working class as a world of material plenty, with hopes channeled into a mere desire for more and more, crass materialism parading as the purpose of life. The American dream was capitalism's answer to the promise of socialism for the working class. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union and China helped put paid to these promises. By the 1980s, with the rise of Euro-communism in Europe, which was, of course, the abandonment of a revolutionary program by the communist parties, and with China marching down the capitalist road, socialism as a dream and a goal for the working class was, for that moment at least, over. By the early 1970s, the end of the post-war era was also beginning to be seen. That was a moment in the history of capitalism when capitalism appeared to have a human face, but the end was already visible. The climax of the Keynesian welfare state was arriving by the mid to late 1970s. What you have in the 1970s is a confluence of a number of influences and trends. By 1971, the microchip has been invented, and very shortly after, there's a proliferation of industrial application of computers. This raises the question of a jobless future, and already by this time you have discussions of a jobless future. In other words, capital could now expand and accumulate without the usual attendant growth in jobs. The computer and its application would soon mean that you could produce goods on a global level, and you could talk about world or global products. It was already by the late 1970s the Japanese could talk about and design something they called a global car or a world car. At that time, unheard of. Today, of course, commonplace, but then unheard of. The working classes would soon find themselves, already in the 1970s, competing across national borders as never before. We also find the growth of the state sector, rising high wages and good salaries, all become barriers to accumulation. And of course, in the 1970s, we already see the rise of financialization, That is to say, vast sums of money without any productive outlet. These sums of money are a product of World War II. They're UNRWA funds, Marshall Aid funds, state deficit financing incurred by European nations in order to reconstruct after the war, vastly increased trade and commerce after the war, recycled petrodollars, illicit, illegal funds, US military spending. All of this turns into what a phenomenon known as euro currency, and it becomes the basis of a vast pool of money that has no national basis but circulates around the world. On the political level, the modern liberal democracy in the 1970s already is coming into question. By 1973, the Trilateral Commission is formed by a group of American capitalists along with representatives from educational institutions and the government. And one of the first projects they embark on is a study of liberal democracy around the world. The Trilateral Commission decides to do a study of democracy in Japan, Western Europe, and the United States. The study comes out in 1974. It's called the governability, coined phrase, a governability of democracy. The conclusion of that study in 1974, at the high point of the Keynesian welfare state, was there is too much democracy. That is to say, by exercising the right to vote, the working class had increased its share of the total social product to the extent that capital was finding it pointless to reinvest. Economic stagnation and high inflation had set in, reflecting the reformist power of the working class through electoral means. They had managed to stall capitalist expansion in its demands for more. The Trilateral Commission, in that study, which is available in most libraries, also concluded that modern democracy needed an apathetic and cynical working class, an electorate. That was the definition of its electorate that was best for liberal democracy. It called also for policies that would curb the benefits of the welfare state and also curb the political power and influence of the working class. In that study, you find the first whiffs of neoliberalism. That's 1974. So capitalism had stalled by the mid-1970s, and it was blamed, of course, that stall was blamed on the welfare state and the power of trade unions. And they were right. The national economies were in many ways already becoming a barrier to global growth. New computer technology cannot be contained by national markets. Increasingly framed by global rules and regulations in trade, the global market undermined the political leverage power of national working classes. It did not, the global economy did not bring better working conditions for the working class, but new problems, lower wages for many, and new strata. So the post-war capitalism with a human face was by and large over by the end of the 1970s. All the conditions that had made it possible were changed, and now capital had to seize the initiative to save itself from further stagnation. Vast sums of non-national money rubbed against national barriers to investment and capital movement. So the political expression of financialization and globalization of the world economy, these are vast sums of money capital without any regulation at the global level. The political expression was Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And they come to power in 1979 and 1980 and bring with them the policies of globalization that we've come to know as neoliberalism. And in effect, they take aim at liberal democracy and industrial relations and the Keynesian welfare state. Effectively, they have behind them financialization, these vast sums of money, and they also have the so-called new economy. The new economy being an economy based on computer production, computer-based distribution, circulation, communication. It means there can be a vast increase in production, a decrease in labor demand, a shift in labor markets from production to service to unemployment and underemployment, a shift to global markets in products and labor. The phenomenon of global labor arbitrage arrives, where corporations can play one national working class off against another. Here we have then an economy based on computers that could promise to eliminate all labor except for the creative side of labor. In reality, by the 1980s, it's clear that it means de-skilling, it means the intensification of work, it means lean production, flexible workforces, robotization, the computerization of an entire range of economic activities. In the political sphere, liberal democracy is, of course, circumscribed by the role of global agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, a variety of UN agencies, the ILO, all kinds of regulations at the global level begin to make their impact on liberal democracy. The role of the national state then becomes more and more controlled by these global agencies, and less can the working class exercise its influence through the electoral means over a national state. So effectively, the working classes begin to lose their leverage over national political systems and national political policies, and find themselves increasingly played off against one another across the globe. So the 21st century arrives, and we begin to see the 21st century is actually ushered in with one of our now the great historic moments, 9/11, and we see the beginning of the security or surveillance state. Terrorism is used as the basis for increasing surveillance, as a tool for creating fear to control the working class and defend continued military spending. We see a rise of new legal arbitrariness, the acceptance of torture, of war crimes, crimes against humanity. Presidents of the United States can even argue that and make legal cases for the acceptability of these kinds of arbitrariness, these kinds of acts. There is an increasing loss of legitimacy of the national state. There is at the same time, of course, a growing consciousness amongst the citizens of the world, the working classes of the world. You find some of the largest demonstrations in history taking place in the early 21st century. But at the same time, you also find the rise of right-wing political movements, organized movements, whereas on the left, while we have these large demonstrations, there's very little organization to speak of. On the political level, on the economic level, we see a jobless future. We see consumers who no longer need to produce. But in this sense, capitalism also begins to reveal something that is hidden for a long time. That is to say, that it needs a working class. But in fact, this is a working class that now no longer has to produce. So a new dilemma arises. We also see the dilemma of liberal democracy arising, that the governability of liberal democracy is no longer, of course, an issue. Democracies can be ruled from another level. I'm not sure if you realize that the situation in Greece earlier this month, in fact, Greece was threatened with a military coup d'etat, which was short-circuited by Papandreou in eliminating the top layer of his military staff on November 3rd or 4th of this month. So, to come back to where we began, the Occupy Wall Street or the Occupy Everywhere movement, we said it was unclear and embryonic, and that is clear, but it is telling us something. and something that we cannot ignore, and that is that we've come to an age, an era of the end of illusions. For now, the Occupy Everywhere movement is tolerated, but this is not where resistance can be left. For there to be real resistance, it has to be a power in its own right, with an analysis, with demands, and a program that takes us into the next stage. Without this, we will end up where they want us and not where we want to be. Thank you.